This is the third episode in a bonus series of Real Democracy Now!, a podcast talking about deliberation, culture and context.
What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now! I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now! Is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 3 in this special bonus series of Real Democracy Now!, a podcast about deliberation, culture and context. This bonus series has been made in collaboration with the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. In this series, I speak with a number of people who have participated in the Centre's recent conference, which brought together scholars from around the world to examine different forms, meanings and significance associated with deliberation in various cultures and contexts. A copy of the conference program is available in the show notes. This conference was supported by John Dryzek's ARC Laureate Fellowship entitled Deliberative Worlds, Democracy, Justice and a Changing Earth System. In this episode, I'm speaking with Emmanuel Ani from the University of Ghana.
My name is Emmanuel Ani. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Ghana, the Department of Philosophy. I specialize in political philosophy. I developed some interest in deliberative democracy about 6 years ago, and I've published quite a set of articles in that field. It was actually one of those articles that was read by one of the professors here, Professor John Dryzek, and he got in touch with me, invited me, and said he wanted me to come and spend a couple of weeks, and that is why I'm here. So I'm in the field of deliberative democracy, and I'm currently running a couple of collaboration projects with some members of this centre.
I spoke with Emmanuel before the conference about his paper, Traditional Roots of Democratic Verbal Discipline, Insights from the Akan of Africa, which he presented on day 2 of the conference. You're speaking this week at the Deliberative Cultures workshop that they're running. Can you tell me a bit about what you're going to be covering in your presentation?
Most countries in Africa adopted a multi-party system of democracy. We can say they largely inherited it from their colonial masters. Somehow, the multi-party system of democracy sits in a certain juxtaposition with some aspects of the culture of many African societies. The idea of going for power in a game-like kind of activity, a game of contest with another group, has not sunk very well. And so what you find is that there are excesses in the practice of the multi-party system. One of those excesses is verbal aggression. There's a lot of strong language, insults, and most of the verbal aggression is between parties, political parties. And so it tends to overheat the system, and I think it strains a lot of the structure of the civil society. So some of my fellow scholars have argued that we perhaps need to do away with the multi-party system. Probably the fault is from the multi-party idea itself, the idea of contesting, But I have a slightly different view. I think that the multi-party system itself is not the problem. I think the problem is the way in which it is being practiced. And my argument is that we need to focus on moderating the language, the language normally used in the business of vying for power on the platform of the political parties. And so in this paper I'm delivering at this conference, I investigated some traditional societies to see how they handled issues of verbal aggression, And it was very interesting. I ran into a particular society, a particular traditional society. It is called the Akan tribe. This tribe is located in West Africa. This tribe had constructed an entire regiment of norms that prohibit verbal aggression. The interesting part is that this particular tribe has a culture that taboos a lot of expressions. It's like sitting down and making a list of most of the indecent language that is being used at a time, and then saying that these are prohibited. So it was very interesting, and my paper goes into details about the kind of verbal expressions that were prohibited by this culture. A lot of things are prohibited. They banned, they tabooed, expressions that are meant to insult various parts of the body. When you say that someone has a big head, someone has bow legs, someone has a fat nose, someone has, those kinds of things. Or when you try to insult someone's profession, you want to cast someone's profession as below other professions, socially speaking. Any expression that by definition is derogatory is identified and discouraged by that culture. And the regime of taboos against expressions, taboo of expressions, is quite elaborate. It's quite admirable. And so, these were in pre-colonial times, so it was an ancient society. We might not be able to go into, a regimen that makes a list of expressions to be outlawed, that kind of thing. But I think we can begin to think along those lines, and look at the principles that, the kind of principles that underlined such practices. I think it was quite admirable. By contrast, the country in which that tribe is located, which is Ghana, is witnessing a lot of verbal aggression in her politics. So I think there's a very radical departure from the past. Probably a lot of our politicians do not know much about their traditional past and things like that. And so I and my colleagues, academic colleagues, we've been digging into that tradition and coming out with a lot of ideas. And one of the projects, we've embarked on a project that somewhat benefits from that research. And it is a project that investigates the most abusive politicians in each election cycle. So if you went on Google and you Googled the most abusive politicians in Ghana, you will find a list of them. So that's one of the results of that project, And so if you are in Ghana, there was a time it was discussed on television. One of the worst, one of the presumably worst, most abusive politicians was being interviewed, and he actually admitted that he made use of some expressions that he wasn't very proud of, So that is probably likely to have a sanitizing effect on the way in which the multi-party system of democracy is being practiced, particularly on the way in which politicians talking to one another, relating to one another, in their quest for power, So my paper essentially captures that, and the central argument is that we might not need to dispense with the multi-party system of democracy. We probably need to look at the way we talk to each other and see if we are respectful enough in our expressions. What kinds of expressions should we guard against? What kinds of expressions should we encourage? even in scenarios where we are engaged in debate, and in disagreement, what is the linguistic, regimen that characterizes our transactions in those situations, So that's the essence of the paper,
And Emmanuel, the relationship between this paper and verbal aggression and deliberative democracy, where do you see those fitting together?
When we engage in disagreement, it is essential to stay on the subject of disagreement. But sometimes you find that certain politicians stray from the topic in an attempt to score cheap points against one another. And so verbal aggression is a subtopic in deliberation that a lot of scholars have not yet thought about, But I think it's something that needs a little more attention. So in that sense, we are embarking on a subfield that needs to be developed, How do you disagree, And how do you get along while competing for the same prize, the same post, the same office, the same position? One of the things that makes verbal aggression and a very important topic in deliberation is that there is a frightening research finding by an empirical researcher called Jan Stetz. Now, Stetz found in a study of over 6,000 people that majority of the cases of physical aggression were actually escalations from verbal aggression. So you can just imagine that kind of research finding. That tells you essentially that verbal aggression doesn't usually stop at verbal aggression. It ignites an atmosphere that tends to hibernate into a different scenario. And so verbal aggression, although not been given much attention yet, is an area that I think is very important in deliberative democracy. That importance may not be appreciated in Western countries, in many Western countries where a lot of people are professional enough to be very civil in their language. But if you came down to West Africa and you listened to the competition on radio and TV that is going on between political parties, then you find a lot of cause for concern, And so it is against that background that I considered it important enough to go into this research,
And I know you've also looked at the issue of consensus in regard to deliberative democracy and so on. Consensus also doesn't fit well with the idea of a multi-party system, the game-like nature, the competition. What's your sense around the value of consensus?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. It's a very important one. My romance with verbal aggression was, it's not as old as my research on consensus. I've been doing a lot of research on consensus, more than 6 years now. And there is a passion for consensus. The irony, or let me say the paradox, is that, in my view, because of the amount of conflict that verbal aggression leads to, there is a growing dissatisfaction with the multi-party system, and then there's a desire to replace it with consensus. But for me, it's a paradox because, like I argued before, the problem might not be the multi-party system. The problem is verbal aggression. So even if you replaced the multi-party system with a consensus system, a consensus of persons, you still have verbal aggression to deal with. Essentially, when there's an argument and there is no control over the language, things will degenerate just as quickly as they degenerate in a multi-party system. So you find that connection, between consensus, the multi-party system, the use of language, And one of my major points is, if we want to incorporate the principles of consensus, the first thing you've got to do is to work on the language. You can't reach a lot of consensus agreements if, we don't have enough respect for each other, Beyond that, I would say that consensus was very fitting in the traditional society setting, perhaps because there were a lot of similarities in beliefs, views. Where there was diversity, there's always diversity anywhere, but it would the traditional society might not have been as diverse as the kind of societies we have today. We have very widely multicultural societies, a lot of nationalities, from across the world living together. I don't reject the idea of consensus entirely. I think it has its own place in a democracy, but my argument is we need to find particular areas where we can encourage the principles of consensus. Presently, if you look at the society, you find that a lot of technical committees, expert committees set up to do specific investigations, they reach a lot of consensus decisions. But you don't find parliamentarians reaching a lot of consensus decisions. In medicine, in the practice of medicine, doctors reach a lot of consensus over a lot of issues. There's one scholar that even boasted that medicine is a consensus-driven discipline. So consensus is popular in some areas, even today, but it's not popular in all areas and at all levels. So I think there are specific places where we could encourage the principles of consensus. And there is a paper I'm delivering tomorrow here at the center, and that paper also argues that consensus also depends on the kind of issues that we deliberate upon. Now, there are certain issues that can easily attract consensus. Those issues on which we can reason very clearly in a mathematical or an empirical manner. Issues where we can make calculations, issues where we can verify facts, issues where we can balance pros and cons. Those issues are less controversial, but there are certain other issues where you find a lot of beliefs,
values,
interest, values, metaphysical notions about the world, beliefs about God and man, intertwined with the issue on that discussion. And so you can't easily separate those issues from all those regimen of beliefs, values, and all that. So those are more difficult areas. So that is essentially what my paper is trying to delineate. There is a division of issues into two broad categories. You have the category type 1. I call them issues type 1. Consensus is a plausible goal in discussing those issues. And then the type 2 issues, not so easy. That's the summary of the paper.
And Emmanuel, it seems to me you used the word respect. And I think respect underpins a number of the things that you've been talking about, the consensus amongst the medical profession and other things like that, and the questions where you're dealing with expertise or a factual basis. Perhaps it's easier in those cases for people to respect one another and therefore work to reach common ground. What's your view on that?
When we are debating about empirical issues, you see, disagreements, let's begin with some basic axioms. We don't have anything like disagreements in mathematics, for instance. What you need to do is to look for the answer and you'll get it. And then about empirical issues, disagreements about empirical issues are resolved more or less by verifying the facts. So whether it is mathematical issues, empirical issues, logistic issues, well, I call them purely logistic because some issues are not purely logistic issues like other logistic issues. Those issues where there's some absence of the conflict of values. In those issues, participants in the deliberation are able to see more clearly the road ahead and are able to make progress in much straightforward fashion, But then you go over to the other sets of issues, and then there is this distinction between several levels of compromise, When you discuss issues that are quite complex because they involve conflicting values, we have different kinds of compromise. You can reach a compromise by both parties abandoning their sets of principles and adopting a third set of principles, Neither party continues with her own set of principles. We forge out a third set of principles, and then the two of us abandons our respective set of principles and then adopt the new set of principles. And then the next kind of compromise is a compromise on principles that are not really exclusive, It's a weak kind of compromise. There's not really much to compromise about. Our principles might conflict, but they are not entirely exclusionary, And then there is the third one, which I think is the most difficult. A compromise that involves abandoning a person's most fundamental principles for their very opposite. So that's the most difficult level of compromise. Actually, someone who compromises in that way could get the feeling that she has compromised herself. It's like the compromiser being compromised. It feels a lot like self-compromise because you feel you've giving yourself away, or something. And then there is a feeling of guilt for having abandoned principles that you truly believe are true, And so that's the pinnacle of the challenge that deliberative democracy faces, And so you have all these levels of issues and how we can reach agreements at each level. And so it is important that we understand all these calibrations so that future research in deliberative democracy could focus on specific areas and see how we could make progress in them.
Yeah, look, that's so interesting. I can see the interrelationship between different pieces of research that you're doing around verbal aggression and around consensus. Is there anything else you'd like to cover off?
I think the future of deliberative democracy research is, I think, quite bright, at least from my own point of view, So thank you very much. It's a field, it's a new field, it's a relatively new field in political science, and I'm very happy to be part of that field.
In future episodes of this bonus series, I'll be speaking to other people who presented at the conference about their papers, as well as those who were on the final roundtable, reflecting on the conference overall. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.